everybody. This is Jim Groom, and that was a little countdown timer for Reclaim TV. I am doing what has become a bit of a regular streaming for me every so often, every couple of months, or at least every month for the last 3 months. But it won't happen in September, but maybe again in October, or maybe I'll do one off the side of my desk. Anyway, these are retro gaming streams or retro computing streams. Previously, in the last 3, I have looked at that machine that's behind me. Let me see if I can get it right. There it is. See that? That's a Windows 98 machine. And I've done a couple about getting it connected to the internet, looking at some of the specifics of it. You know, it's just kind of getting into what it's like to compute on a Windows 98 machine and playing games and using stuff like ISO, CD emulation tools. It's kind of fun, and I probably will return to that. But about a month ago, before I traveled back to the US and had some other things, I got sidetracked on another retro computing concern, if you will, which was I had set up back in 2020. Right, this is like the heyday of the pandemic. Tim and I were going to start Reclaim Arcade, but everything got put on hold. So as a result of that, you know, everyone went into their own little cocoon and did their own little projects. One of the projects I worked on was using, and let's see, I'm going to switch to this, using this machine right here. This is a Raspberry Pi 3B. And this machine I used to create a system called RetroPie, or install an operating system called RetroPie. And so what RetroPie does is essentially uses a system called Emulation Station and RetroArch, amongst other things, to create a old retro console and computer gaming system, where you can load ROMs onto these across various systems, and we'll take a look at that and play it. So for some reason at the end of July, right before I started traveling, I wanted to install C64, Commodore 64, as a system on my RetroPie, which was still running on a Raspberry Pi 3B. So I started the process, and lo and behold, the operating system that had been running it, and I was on an older version, so I was like, okay, it's time to update it. So the operating system that I had been running, which was, I think it was like RetroPie 3.7 or something, was woefully out of date. On top of that, the Raspbian Stretch, which was the operating system I was using, had been deprecated and was no longer being supported. So they switched operating systems for the RetroPie to, I believe it's Debian Buster. I believe we'll look at that in a second. We'll get the details. So RetroPie, for me to upgrade it to the latest version to get C64 emulator working, which is called Vice, I had to upgrade the whole entire system, and I was worried about that. So there were some tools out there to make backups of your flash drive or of your micro drive, which is all you need to do. And then you can start playing with it. So I did. And I started getting deep into the woods of going to the latest version. So the latest version of Raspberry Pi, which was released, of not Raspberry Pi, but of RetroPie, which runs on the Raspberry Pi, was released 2 years ago, or more than 2 years ago. Here is the Happy Pi Day. It's RetroPie 4.8. That's when it was released. And that was in March 14th, 2022. So I don't know what the status is of the project, but it hasn't had major releases in about 2 years. But I wanted to at least get my RetroPie updated. And you know, updating systems, especially when you're changing the underlying operating system, can be a nightmare. And I had my RetroPie working for 3 systems: for MAME arcade games, so the games you would play, the cabinets in the arcade; Atari 2600, which is the old gold console for Atari; and Atari 5200, which is it was a failed console. We'll talk more about it, but I loved it for various reasons, which we'll look into. So those are the three systems I had on my RetroPie. Didn't have an extensive collection, but those three I had pretty much most of the games that were out there. So anyway, I had to now upgrade my whole RetroPie. So as I went through it and spent hours kind of trying it and backing up systems and trying it again, I read on a forum somewhere, it's like, hey, you know what? The Raspberry Pi 3B will no longer work with RetroPie 4.8. You need to really go to a Raspberry Pi 4 to get certain things working, not everything. But the things I needed a Raspberry Pi 4B, 4B. So I ordered that, and not until I came back from America was I able to test that theory out to see if my system would work on the Raspberry 4B. So anyway, that's what this stream will be about, is my kind of trials and tribulations of getting the Raspberry or the RetroPie working on the Raspberry Pi 4B. A lot of pies in there, so forgive me. So anyway, this is the download page. This is on retropie.org.uk, and it's a UK project, and it really is fun. I love the folks who did it, and they're taking donations. And again, I think they still update it. The forums are pretty active, but I don't know how often they do major releases. I'd have to look at that. But anyway, I now needed the new operating system, which again is not running on Raspbian Stretch anymore, which has been kind of out of support and outdated. It's running on Buster, so a Raspbian Buster, I think. So I clicked here, right, and I've already done this, and it's kind of downloading the RetroPie Buster. There it is, so it is Buster. And so that operating system is downloading, and this is the process you would go through to install a RetroPie onto a micro SD card, which would then be inserted into your Raspberry Pi. So let's go through that together, because I've actually worked out a system, and we'll look at FTP in a bit, where I'm going to try this in the wild. So there is a program or application out there that I highly recommend. It's called Raspberry Pi Imager. And this is what allows you to take that SD card for the Raspberry Pi 4B. It's a micro SD card. And you can choose, what Raspberry Pi you have, whether you have Raspberry Pi 3, which we're not using, 4, which we are using. There's a Raspberry Pi 0, which costs like $10, $15, and I'm using that for my Creepshow installation, and that's great. So I love that. It's so cheap and does a lot for what I need it for. So we're going to be using the Raspberry Pi 4, so we'll do that. And then we're going to choose the operating system. Now this is where, once you've downloaded that RetroPie operating system, you would go to Custom, and from here you would choose the RetroPie Buster 4.8. I downloaded it twice for demonstration purposes, but I'm going to go with the original. And that now is the operating system I'll be installing. And then the storage, I have a couple of SD cards. The 32 gig is the one I'll be using, but that will show you which SD card you have installed. For me, this is the micro. And then I go to Next, and I now can customize this SD card and the operating system before I essentially write it, which is really useful because you'll need to SFTP into, or SSH into the Raspberry Pi to add files and do customizations. So I find the Raspberry Pi Imager tool is amazing because right from this button here, Edit Settings, you can go in here and you can make sure the settings for your Raspberry Pi are connected to your wireless, which makes it simple, and also you make sure you set your username and password. I'm going to make the password and username the default, which is Pi, and the password is Raspberry. So that's the default. I'm going to keep it there for now. This is configured to connect to my home wireless, so that's all set. A big piece here is the services. You're going to want to make sure SSH is enabled, and you can use password authentication. This will make sure you can SFTP and SSH in. And then the other options, I don't use this. I just have whatever is there. So these are my basic settings, and I'm going to want to save them. And I had to actually make sure the wireless was linked to my country, which is Italy. So there we go. That's all set. I've done those pre-settings. And now it's going to write, right? So yes, would you like to apply those? Yes. All data on your SD drive will be overwritten, right? So be sure that you don't need anything else on that SD card because it will be gone, and do it. So this is happening. I just have to give it permission. And this is now writing that operating system onto the SD card, and it will verify it. So that's great. While that's happening, let's take a look. And this all takes you through the process. The forums for RetroPie are great, so no worries there. But this is the Raspbian stretch that is no longer supported. And this was the forum where I realized I got to go to a new one, which is Raspbian Buster. And then there's a great article which will take you through the installation on RetroPie. It's basically in their docs, which will take you through much of what I'm doing here. And so this is all documented. You don't necessarily need to follow mine. They tell you about the Raspberry Pi Imager and all of this stuff, which is quite useful. We'll also configure the controller. I'm using a Sony PlayStation 4 controller for mine. And then it takes you through all the different button mapping, etc. It's very well documented as a project and very fun to do. So anyway, the documentation for retropie.org.uk is definitely go to, as well as the forums are. The underlying technology for the RetroPie are two major ones. There's more, but the two ones is RetroArch, which provides a lot of the configuration for these various game systems that allow you to emulate not just one or two old consoles, but many. And we'll look at some of that are offered in a second. And then Emulation Station, which actually gives you that elegant configuration that when we have our Raspberry Pi RetroPie running, you'll be able to see this. So both of these work together. This is an open source project. I imagine RetroArch 2 is, but I don't know that for sure. So anyway, that's basically the underlying technology that makes a RetroPie work. So now let's go back and verifying. We're almost verified. And once we are verified with our operating system running, what we are going to do is we're going to take it out of the computer and then switch over to our Raspberry Pi and try and install it. Fun, fun, fun. Okay, so that's done. I am now going to get rid of the RetroPie, get it out of my computer, and then switch over to the system that is running the Raspberry Pi. So hold on a second while I insert the SD card, which is what I just did. And then I'm going over to the RetroPie and I'm going to turn it on. Let's see what happens. So I am turning on that machine, which I got a Raspberry Pi 8 gigabytes, and it is a very powerful little machine for like 50 or 60 bucks. You have an 8 gigabyte machine, essentially, that's in your hand or palm. And I really do love Raspberry Pis. I have several of them, and I never get old. I never get tired of them. Okay, so this will be a black screen just because the Raspberry Pi is loading, and here it goes. And so it's going to load up a bit. This is a fresh boot of a RetroPie operating system. And I'll show you how this works. So again, we just formatted the disk, we imaged the disk, we confirmed that image, and now we will be loading it, which is happening here. Okay, and you'll notice I think it says Raspbian GNU Raspbian 10. But okay, here we go. For all those of you who like the startup screen, this is for you. I know you love it. I know you can dig it. All right, so all things being equal now, Emulation Station is loading, and you'll see all the different game systems you can emulate. It's pretty impressive. They load there. And then the first thing it asks you to do is to actually set up your controller. So I'll be doing this. I just want to give you a kind of camera view of this. So what that looks like is, hold on, I'll, with my phone, show you, there's my controller. So what it's going to do is going to ask me to click one of these buttons and then map all of these different buttons on the PS4 controller onto my Raspberry Pi. And you can see it there, kind of. That's my screen. That's asking me to do that. I kind of see it. But anyway, that's what's happening on my end. Okay, let's go back to the RetroPie and let's do this. Okay, so we're going to go gamepad detected. We're going to click that. And now I have to map either, and I would be careful with this because if you map them wrong, sometimes you get locked out and have to redo it. So I spend some time doing this. There's up, there's down, there's left, there's right. Because if you're dyslexic like me, your left and right start to get very confusing and you begin to screw it up. So I have to really think about what's my left and what's my right still. See, I just missed the left thumb, left analog up, left analog down, left, right, up, down, left, right. And then hotkey is the PlayStation key for me, and then that's it. I missed a couple there, but none that are important. I've done this enough to know. And so then my RetroPie game configure, basically my joypad or gamepad is configured. So here I am in RetroPie. Now, I am going to focus, there are a lot of different emulation systems. And many people have talked about many of them, so you don't necessarily need me to take you through all of them. But one in particular that I want to work on, because it's one of the more difficult, is Atari 5200. I will have my original ROMs, which are for MAME games, Atari 2600 and 5200 copied into this Pi. So we will copy them. But I also need to do some configuration before we do. So let me start here at the configuration piece. Let me go in here. There we go. I just pressed that. And one of the things you can do right away, which I think is very useful, is in the RetroPie configuration, they have a place where it says show IP. I would recommend you do that. And then you'll get a kind of small dialog box, which will, it's hard for you to read, but my IP is 192.168.86.32. So that's the IP for my Raspberry Pi. And I'm going to need that for SSHing or SFTPing into the system. So that's all set. I have that, right? So now I have kind of what I need for the Raspberry Pi in terms of access. I'll need to do more here in the configuration, but for now, let's switch over to my screen on my computer because there's a next step we're going to have to do. So one of the things we're going to want to do, and I have this pre-configured, is we're going to want to SSH or SFTP into this Raspberry Pi to upload files. We basically have to upload ROM files for the various consoles we use. And that's what I'll do, as well as configuration files. And I'll talk about them in a second. Anyway, though, my IP address is 192.168.86.32. My username is Pi, and my password is Raspberry, which are default, not recommended, but for this stream, it's fine because this Pi is going away. And I will click connect, and it will connect. And there I am. I have logged in. Let me go full screen here. I have logged into my Raspberry Pi, and this is kind of logging into an operating system, a Linux operating system, which thanks to Reclaim, I have now some experience with. And I can see here in the RetroPie area, there are a couple of folders. So this is the main area where the stuff for the RetroPie is kept, like the ROMs and the BIOS files. for me, the things I need to do for the RetroPie, I need to do two things, and I'll do them right now. I need to basically upload my ROMs files. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the ROMs files, and there you see them, right? Let me go back to ROMs. ROMs, there they are, right? You get a sense of some of the systems just by looking at the ROM files that are supported. I'm going to turn this one off because I already have another ROMs folder that I'm going to copy over quick. But essentially what you would do is if you had ROMs for the Atari 2600 or 5200 or ColecoVision or N64 or whatever the system, PS1 I think there is here too, you would copy the ROMs into those folders. That's essentially what you're doing. And ROMs are basically the code that make a specific game work. And the console is basically the hardware, quote unquote, emulated that the actual RetroPie is doing for you. So you just need the game files for most of them. So anyway, I'm gonna copy my ROMs folder that I already have over. So give me a second while I do that. Here we go. So that's gonna copy, and so my ROMs folder is copying over, as you can see here. Boom, all they go. Now, while that's happening, there's another thing I need to do, is I need to copy in some BIOS folders. Now, the BIOS folders are needed for my Atari 5200, and this is what makes Atari 5200 very confusing to install, is it needs 5 different BIOS folders. In fact, these are the, I don't know if I can show them to you, hold on. Yeah, give me a second. These are the BIOS folders right here. These 5, which is 5200.ROM, Atari BAS.ROM, Atari OSA.ROM, Atari OSB.ROM, and Atari XL.ROM. Now these BIOS files have to deal with the fact, and I'm not going to pretend to fully know, but they basically, why Atari 5200 can be so complex to install is because the Atari 5200 was essentially built on top of the Atari 800 computer. So after Atari 2600, or the VCS system, which was a huge hit, they started building the next version, which rather than becoming 5200, which essentially it would become, it became a full-blown computer, the Atari 800. And so they essentially built a console on top of that computer, the Atari 800, and then the console stripped away possibilities of the computer so that it would be a console to protect certain elements so it wouldn't be competitive with other computers, etc. So these ROM files, or these BIOS files, are what you need to kind of, I think, emulate some of the computing of the Atari 800. So we'll get into that. Again, I don't want to pretend too much knowledge there because I have some idea of how all this works, but again, I'm tinkering around the sides. So the ROM files did load. My ROM files, if I go into Atari 2600, you'll see all my 2600 games. If I go into 5200, you'll see all my 5200 games. And then I also have a bunch of games in the arcade file, which is essentially the MAME file, or where I do my arcade cabinets. Okay, so let's go back to the RetroPie. I'm going to go back to the RetroPie. There it is. And here I am. I've accessed the computer. I've added the BIOS files and all the ROMs. Now, one of the things I need to do is I need to go into RetroPie setup. And this is to get the Atari 5200 working, to be clear. I need to go in here. And once I'm in here, I will need to set something up. And it should be running that. There you see it. I'm command line Kung Fu right now. But it will be an old school interface, right? Where this is the kind of RetroPie interface. You just click through OK. And there's a space here with the RetroPie setup script where I want to go to Manage Packages, essentially. And then I want to go to Manage Main Packages. And I want to go down to the LR Atari 800 package. This is installed via binary, but I want to install it via source. I'm kind of reinstalling the Atari 800. And so now you see the source code for the 5200 is actually Atari 800 source code, which does point to the fact that 5200 is built on top of the Atari 800 computer. Now it's doing that. I'm going to go down to install from source. I'm going to click, and then I'm going to say, are you sure? Yes, and boom. So you're going to see some installation happening here, and essentially Atari 5200 now will be installing from source on this computer. There may be some other things I have to look at, but once this is done, we're going to restart the Raspberry Pi with RetroPie as the OS, and we're going to see what happens. All right, so it's all set. I'm going to just go back. I'm going to go back, back, exit, and then we're going to be pushed back out to the configuration. If I click the start button, I'll be able to kind of restart everything, which I'm going to want to do. So I'll just restart the entire system. Maybe I could just restart the emulation system, but for good luck, I'm going to restart everything. And then we're going to go into the Raspberry Pi, and we're going to say, okay, does this work, right? Can we play Atari 5200 games? We'll start with the MAME games, then we'll look at the 2600 games, then we'll go to the 5200 games, and we'll see if we have solved it by including the BIOS files. I don't think that's everything. I think we still have to do more, but we will see, okay? So the RetroPie is starting up. Here we go. And now, rather than it only being the RetroPie configuration option, we're going to see the emulation system has several, right? It has any system that I've included ROMs with now shows up, and it tells me how many ROMs. So there's 854 Atari 2600 games. There's how many? 279 arcade games. And then there's another 60 Atari 5200 games. Atari 5200 only had, I think, 80-something games all told. It was a kind of failure. But at the same time, I like it, and we'll look at why I like it so much in a second. But before we do, let's look at the arcade. So here are some of my arcade games. Let's go to one I think I know works, so I'm not. Okay, let's try elevator action. We'll go in there, and it is now asking me to choose what MAME system, and I'm going to go with MAME 2300. We'll see if this works. I didn't configure MAME, but you might be asked to do that, and then we will see. There it is, right? So let's go here. There we go. And then if I press play, beep, beep, beep. All right, great. This is of elevator action, looking pretty good. This is the video game version that you would play in an arcade. Right, so I press start and the PS button. That gets me out of a given game and back into the menu. So I'm in arcade menu, but if I click to the left, it will take me right to the Atari 2600 menu, which is always fun. And if I go to, say, a game like Adventure, the Atari 2600 really just loads seamlessly. There is no issue with it loading. It just goes right into the game. So here we are. And I'm going to click this, and I don't know how many of you remember this game, but here's a classic. This is the Atari 2600. So I'm going to get my sword, got the key. I'm going to go kill some dragons, as you do in this 8-bit masterpiece. And there we go. Okay, so going there, moving over. Anyway, you get the idea. Atari 2600 is working fine. So I can now move over to the next group, which is the Atari 5200. Now, will 5200 blend? I don't know. Let's try Galaxian. I'll go here. Now, we might get something strange. We might get like an Atari 5200 memo. And if that's the case, we've got to change something. Oh, but no. But no! Look at that. Atari 5200 is working out of the box. So I just showed you how to get 5200 working, and obviously I have the configuration of the joystick for 5200 can be a real pain. but I have that working seamlessly. And all I did is, if you do this from scratch, all I did is copy those 5 BIOS folders into the BIOS folder. So the 5 BIOS files into the BIOS folder, right, which is over here. So I just copied these 5 in, and those were essential. And then I copied the ROMs into Atari 5200, and by reinstalling from source code the 5200, which is LR-800, that's the Atari 800 system, it configures everything for you. The mapping of the games, the loading, it's beautiful. So we can play several games on here, and we will, but I essentially, in about 15 or 20 minutes, got the RetroPie up and running with 3 different consoles, old consoles. Well, 2 consoles, the Atari 2600 and 5200, and then hundreds of old school arcade games. Now, the game that I fell in love with Atari 5200 with was this one. This was the Pac-Man for Atari 5200. And we'll play this a bit, so let me make sure it plays. There it is. And this, if you are an Atari fan, it's going to be interesting, because one of the things you're going to realize is there's a big difference. I don't know why this is having some breakup, but let me just break that up, okay? So anyway, you saw it was kind of interrupting a little bit there. But you saw it with the Atari 5200. One of the things that happens is there's a gliding on the emulation. So that's Atari 5200 emulated Pac-Man. But that Pac-Man for the 5200, you know, if you're a kid in 1984 or 1983 when the system comes out, or did it come out in 82? Maybe 82, was mind-blowing, because it was basically like taking Pac-Man from the arcades and bringing it in your home. Now, what did a Pac-Man for the 2600 look like? Well, that's actually worth taking a look at right now. So I am going to go to a new shot, and this is going to look at Atari 2600 for Pac-Man. So let's take a look at this. This is the Atari 2600 Pac-Man, and this is what that looked like. Right, so think about this versus the 5200 Pac-Man. Right? Like, it's a big difference. Like, this wasn't a terrible game, but I was very disappointed when I got this, and it didn't look like the 5200, which is essentially a replica of the Atari, the Pac-Man in the arcade. So anyway, that's the Atari 5200. No, that's the Atari 2600. And we'll talk a little bit about how I'm doing this. This is the actual game. This is not emulated. This is just a version coming to you directly from a console I have. And it's not the 2600 console, it's a 7800 console. And we'll look at that in a second. I'm just going to kill myself off. Otherwise, you'll keep hearing that sound. So anyway, that's the 2600. Now let's look at the 5200 console. But again, not emulated. This is the actual console. So this is the actual 5200 console. I have one, and I wanted to test on the stream getting it up and running. So here I'm going to unpause, and I'm going to run this here. So this is this. Now notice Pac-Man on this, because we're going to go back to the one that's emulated. You see Pac-Man? He is not. Like, there's no glide, right? He's consistent. You can eat, boom. So this, again, is the actual 5200 physical version, not emulation. And this is, I'm streaming right now from a actual machine that I have here in the house. And I am doing it. Now, notice I can pause that. That's pretty impressive, right? That's because of the whole underlying OS, which is a computer. So now let's shift again back to the RetroPie. So I'm going to shift screens to the RetroPie. We're going to go in and we're going to look at Pac-Man. Now this is kind of blinking on and off a little bit, which is weird, but maybe that will stop now. But we're going to go to Pac-Man. Yeah, exactly, right? You can see the difference between the 2600 and 5200. For me, it was mind-blowing to see this game. But now look at not only is the screen stretched a bit in the emulation, but look at Pac-Man. He glides in the emulation. It's an imperfection in the emulation. He's a glider, and he's not ever gliding when you do the physical hardware. So when people talk about the difference between emulation and physical hardware, there's a lot of differences. I find most of them are with the peripherals or the game pads. It's very hard to reproduce the interface of the game, of trying to kind of control it. But at the same time, you know, they're pretty good for what they are. But for me, it's interesting because on Pac-Man, you could see that Pac-Man glides. And he never glides on the 52 version when you have the physical. I mean, there are problems maybe with the physical machine, but the emulation is pretty imperfect, at least with Pac-Man. Now, there's another one I want to show you. Oh, actually, let me take a break here and show you a little bit about what I'm doing on the stream, how I'm doing it. So I spent most of the time setting up the stream because I love this kind of stuff. I love connecting old technology to new technology. It's one of my funnest things in the world. But let's go to the phone, or what is now not a phone. You'll notice I got rid of my phone. I'm using a Sony ZV-E10 because the phone was very inconsistent. We're going to go to the camera and we're going to look at the setup. So you'll notice that's the TV that's running the Atari 5200, which is right here. That's the actual console you saw that didn't glide. And that's this. And then beneath it is the Atari 7800, which is running this Atari 2600 Pac-Man. Now, quick little history. Atari 7800 was supposed to come out in '84. The crash of the video game kind of market prevented that, but it was basically '84 is when they discontinued the Atari 5200 because it proved to be not nearly as successful as 2600, and they didn't make it backward compatible at first, so you couldn't play 2600 games on 5200 until you got adapter. They did put out a version later on that could play 2600 games, but again, by that time, the 5200 was out the door. 7800 was the follow-up, right? So you'll notice they didn't call the Atari 2600 until 5200 came out. And that's when Atari 2600 was named that. It was kind of a post-facto thing to distinguish it from the 5200. And then finally the 7800, which has the unique and I think venerable kind of, I would say, attribute that it was the first backward compatible console. So anything you could play on 2600, you could play on the 7800. That was not true for the 5200. You couldn't play 5200 games on the 7800, but you could play all the 2600 games. So I am running this Pac-Man right here for the 2600 on an Atari 7800. If you're following me, you're better than me. So let's talk a little bit about how I'm doing this. So how am I getting this and this into my stream? Well, that's awesome. You asked, now let me tell you. The Atari 5800, at least this one, the Atari 5200, I get them all confused, at least this one, runs off of RF. So essentially, you would need to plug it into the RF connector, right? Or that game switcher that you used to get. Now a lot of modern TVs, like this is a 90s JVC, don't have, well, this one has an RF, but they really prefer the RCA inputs. Anyway, I am taking the RF from the Atari 5200 and I am running it into this VCR, into the RF in from antenna. And from there, and that's an OmniVision Panasonic, it's a great VCR. And then I'm taking the RF out to TV and going back to the TV so you can see what's coming out of the 5200. But then there's also an RCA audio and video out which I am then taking that RCA out, putting it into this switcher box, and then running it into a cam link right here. So that's how I am getting that image onto this. For this image, this is a US NTS TV. This is a PAL Sony Trinitron. It's a beautiful TV. I mean, 27 inches of magic. It's just a gorgeous picture. Probably the best picture I've ever seen a VHS tape on. Anyway, I am now coming from the Atari 7800, which has the modification on it for a super video and RCA out. This you can also do for the Atari 5200. I haven't. But the person I bought the Atari 7000 from did it. So I could take that RCA, which is super video and RCA audio, pull it in here, and then using let me find it, an S-cart here, I am going S-cart out. So these S-carts are interesting because you have the ability to decide whether they go in or out, and then I can convert them immediately to RCA. So I am going out of that TV, the back of it has an S-cart out, and I am using something just like this. So that's S-cart, it's particular to the European TVs, unlike what we would have RCA. Converts it to RCA, and then that goes into this switcher, that's input 2. So I have both inputs coming into this. So when I go to the Atari, I can press this button and switch between Atari 7800, Atari 5200, very seamlessly. So that's how I'm doing that. Pretty cool, right? So now, that's how, and that's all going into a cam link here, which basically is another video source for my OBS, and they can find it. Finally, which this whole stream was about, this is my Raspberry Pi 4B. This is the baby that I got to update my RetroPie scenario. This has, if you can see here, it has, this is its power, which is USB-C. This is a micro HDMI, and it has 2 micro HDMI. So this is not only 8 gigabyte computer, it also has dual monitors. That said, the Raspberry RetroPie OS, so the RetroPie OS does not manage 2 dual displays. So in order to get this one to stream into my computer so I could have it on the stream, which is basically the RetroPie, I had to run it into this capture card, which is by Elgato. It's the HD60X Elgato card. So it's coming in here. So HDMI is coming into here. It's then passing it out, so pass through or whatever you would call it, right into this USB 3. And then this is now bypassing it back to this monitor. So I now have the Raspberry Pi, or the RetroPie, going like that, and it works perfectly because I have that Elgato card. So pretty slick in terms of the streaming setup. The final piece here to maybe mention, for anyone interested at home, is audio is always a beast. There's no two ways about that. We all know that if you've done this. We just had a radio. I was so impressed with the DS-106 radio summer camp because the audio was so good. And I'll talk about that fan, Tim. Absolutely. I'll talk about that in a second because it's a good point. The audio I'm doing, Camlink audio, I have that really down. That's basically where you're hearing the Atari 5200 and the 7800. So I have that down to 20 so I could talk over it, but if I don't, they're loud. The HD60, that's where I'm running the Raspberry Pi into, and that's again down to about 17%. This is my main mic in case I have a problem with my wireless, but this is muted. It's muted on the actual microphone, and then my wireless go is working seamlessly. And I have them all going into an audio input called RetroPie. And then in OBS, I'm just attaching all of those and a little bit of everything. I have my camera, screen capture, but then also the RetroPie audio. And that's on all the different shots I have. And that just makes sure my audio is consistent across. So that's how I'm doing audio. Now, to the question, which is a good one, asked by Tim in the chat. And thank you, Tim and Eric, for watching. I know this is a little bit, I can't believe, I mean, I don't know if my audio levels are good or everything, but like I've been working on this all week. So I'm hoping that it's pretty consistent and seamless. I did get the fan for the Raspberry Pi 4 because I do have an 8 gigabyte processor. The fan is loud though. And you're like, oh, I can't hear the fan. So is he running a fan? I am. But I turned it off for the stream. And last night I added 3 heat sinks onto the CPU, the main CPU, the RAM, and I think it was like the Ethernet card or the USB card. But to those 3 ones, I added heat sinks because that's keeping it down to a good level. The RetroPie, luckily, is not very intensive. This machine can do it in its sleep. It's definitely over-engineered for how I'm using it. But still, the machine gets hot. It does. And the fan makes it better. The problem with the fan is it's loud, and for a stream, it would be super, super annoying. So to your point, I bought the whole kit for like $150. That gave me the sinks, that gave me the USB, and then that gave me the Raspberry Pi 8 gigabyte version. It gave me a nice case, and it gave me all the kind of plugs I needed, some extras. It was good. I recommend it. The HD60X was super nice. That was really allowed me to stream the RetroPie computer screen so seamlessly. I was having problems. I was assuming I would be able to do the dual monitor, but when the dual monitor didn't work, I was able to find that. So that, again, for the viewers at home, to Eric's point, this is the Elgato HD60X, and then that's the old Raspberry Pi 8 gigabytes. And again, this is bypassing one of them is going out to my computer for the stream, and then another one's going right on to this monitor. So you kind of see my setup, right? Got 3 monitors going, 1 dedicated to the Raspberry Pi, and then 2 other, this is the best part, 2 other TV screens, right? That's all wild. So, and then I got the camera, which seems to be working perfectly. So I'm very happy. Anyway, that's a quick stream, I guess, of how you would get, let's kind of review, how you get RetroPie 4.8, which is the latest version, came out 2 years ago, imaged for the Raspberry Pi 4B. Then how to set up the settings so you can SSH in cleanly, SFTP, as well as automatically connected to your wireless network. Very useful. Then, if you're installing different consoles, you would upload the ROMs. And then if you're installing very particular consoles like Atari 5200, you might have to update BIOS for the Atari 800 system. And I went through all that. And then you go in and you test it. One of the things with the RetroPie is that, you know, a lot of times you have to map some of the controllers. I like the PS4 controller. It does pretty much everything I want. But the problem for me with emulation is controllers are not one-to-one. There's a lot of games you can't play, like Missile Command on the 5200, you just can't play it because it needs a trackball. And there are people out there who make them, but I haven't gotten that deep down. But when you start getting into different peripherals for each of these systems, it gets really complicated. But there are people who know a ton, and the forums are full of all sorts of great advice. So recommendations all around there. The other thing too here is I just fell down a hole with the RetroPie 4B and the latest version because once I get into something, I can't stop. And it's also, it fuels my interest in tinkering around a lot of this stuff. But Taylor has a really cool system called the Mister, which is emulation, kind of like hardware, it's like not necessarily emulating the hardware. I mean, FPGA is this weird kind of space where it's better than emulation because it's like hardware emulation, or it's reproducing on the hardware level. And there are people who have built all sorts of ports for MiSTer, which do a lot of what something like the RetroPie does. And I haven't been able to get my hands on a MiSTer. I mean, they were like hard to get. I think they're available now. They're not cheap. They're closer to $500, where you can build a RetroPie literally for under 100. But I am interested in the FPGA stuff, and I think I'd love to get one of those, install Atari 5200, 2600, and then compare. Because I like the comparisons. I like to look how different systems run on different hardware or emulation or whatever. Here's a good for example. Like, let's go back to this. All right, we're going to go to RetroPie. There we are. And then I'm going to go, and I'm going to pick this game. And then Berserk. So let's look at Berserk. One of the things about Berserk that was interesting for me is, and this is another bit about the 5200 that's of interest, is Atari 2600 couldn't even pretend to do voices, right? It wasn't very good at having that, whereas Berserk did on the 5200. And you'll see it when the dude comes out. Oh, will it kill me? Okay. And watch this, though, because I'm going to try and wait for the dude to come. We'll see. It's the bouncing happy face, right? So we'll see what happens there. There he goes. Watch this. Say anything?
The humanoid must not escape.
Yeah, see, he says it. The humanoid must not escape. Now, that's impressive, but when he talks and you're in the middle of gameplay, the gameplay freezes. There he is, right? So Atari 2600, I mean, this is a pretty amazing port. This is like Berserk in the arcade, frankly. I mean, it's not that different. That said, the Atari 2600 Berserk port is very good. See, he stopped me when it said intruder alert. Like, I couldn't move, right? On the arcade version, you could move. So that's interesting. You freeze because the computer can't deal with you moving and the voice recognition at the same time. But I love the fact that the computer talks, and that's on the 5200, right? So let's look at it on the 2600, and this is going to be all emulated, but we could go the other way. So many Atari 2600 games, it's ridiculous. But let's find Berserk. Do I have it here? Yeah, there it is. 1982, the Berserk. Another thing people didn't like about 5200 is just reproduced a lot of what I already had for 2600, and it was like buying the same game again. But if you looked at Pac-Man, there was a reason for that. Okay, so this is the 2600 Berserk, right? But there's no talking. Like, you're not going to hear the computer say anything. Now let's watch this. You get the idea, right? And when the dude comes out, let's wait for him. Boo, 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 boo. Where is he? I don't know where he is. But whatever, it goes right through. Boom. There we go. See, this is not a bad port, but the port for 5200 compared to this, amazing. Right? Like, there's no comparison. So let's go. Oh. Now, so that's the 2600. Again, no speaking. Now, let's go to the arcade version. So there's that. Here's the arcade version of Berserk. Let's see, hopefully this set works. Boom, boom. It should. And this hopefully will give you a sense of how close the 5200 is to the arcade. But the audio samples don't seem to be working. Let's go here. All right. Yeah, I got to look at the audio samples, but they're not. So that's another thing with MAME emulation. You'll find, like, if I were to choose another MAME emulator, not the one I'm using right now, these audio files would work. But again, this guy comes, and they're all talking now. And he doesn't stop when they talk, right? He just keeps going. So that's one of the limitations between the 5200 and, say, the arcade version, right? So it's interesting to think of the different kind of version limitations. I'm sorry that the audio wasn't working on that one. I should have tested it. But you get the idea. Like the Atari 5200, when it comes to having the arcade in your house in the 80s, right? This was impressive. Like Berserk in 1983 versus the one in 82 was night and day in terms of how much better it was. Centipede was good, but another thing about what I like about Atari 5200 emulation, and this is kind of cool if you get into emulation, is you see all these games that are proto. These are games that were never released in production. They were basically prototypes that people had created, but given that they killed the system, they never came out. Like Pac-Man Jr., Millipede, which is a really good prototype. I like this game a lot. And I love the fact that you can play these games really anywhere else, but you can play them in emulation because they came out, someone put them out. And Millipede is pretty much a finished game. It's pretty impressive. So I'm going to start there. Press start. Do it. So here we go. All right, I got to do it again. And press fire. There we go. So there we go. Look, like this is, I mean, obviously Millipede, the arcade version is very different, but this has a lot going on, as does Millipede. It has the two spiders. It has the kind of bugs. It will have the earwigs. It has a lot of the features of the original Millipede, the DDT, right? I mean, it has the sound effects that are really good. I mean, the sound for the Atari 5200 is pretty good. The thing that killed, I mean, there's many things that might have killed the 5200, but one of the biggest was the joystick. The joystick was reviled. Everybody hated it. I can understand why. It played pretty well for Pac-Man, which was the game I wanted for the Atari 5200 anyway. But you get a sense of when you start playing a game with the 5200 joystick for any amount of time, your hand starts to hurt. Like, it's terrible. So anyway, that's the Millipede. And Millipede for 5200 versus 2600 looks really good. So it's a big difference. Even just in a year or two, when you build a console on top of a computer. So anyway, that is a look at the RetroPie, the most recent version, running the MAME ROMs, the Atari 2600 ROMs, and some of these Atari 5200 ROMs, many of which you'll find are prototypes. Another great Roadrunner is such a weird game. But what's another great prototype? Stargate, quite good prototype, but a great prototype. And I have it here. I don't think I included it here. Zaxxon. Zaxxon is, oh, actually, it's not a prototype. Zaxxon is actually something that came out. There is an actual cartridge. Anyway, tons of fun stuff with the 5200. And if you're into the 5200 like I am, you can follow the instructions and get it running. Okay. With that, I will say goodbye on this stream. This has been a retro computing, retro gaming stream looking at the RetroPie. It was super fun to do. And if you were watching along, I just want to say thank you. All right. See you soon.